The hunted, the moon hung low in the sky, a bloated silver eye watching as we trudged deeper into the woods. Sara, leading the way with her flashlight slicing through the October mist, laughed at something one of the others had said, but her voice was distant, swallowed by the thickening air. The forest was alive tonight, full of shifting shadows that seemed to move just beyond the reach of our light, whispering in a language only the wind could speak. We were 4 friends, foolish enough to think a Halloween night hike would be fun. That's what the town legends were for, right? Scare the tourists with tales of ghosts and creatures that lurked in the trees. Harmless. Old wives' tales told by bored locals with nothing better to do. We didn't believe a word of it. But as the path beneath our feet narrowed, I began to wonder if maybe we should have listened. The deeper we went, the more the woods felt wrong. Too quiet. The kind of silence that presses down on your skin, makes the hair on your arms stand up, like something is holding its breath, waiting. Sara's flashlight flickered just for a moment, casting wild shadows that danced across the twisted trunks of the trees. Stupid batteries, she muttered, shaking the light. It steadied, but my gut churned. Maybe we should head back, I suggested, not wanting to sound like a coward, but unable to shake the feeling that we weren't alone. It was the stillness. The kind of silence that wrapped itself around your throat, squeezing until you couldn't breathe right. Sara rolled her eyes, always the bravest, or maybe just too stubborn to admit when something didn't feel right. We've only been walking for half an hour. It's fine. Besides, we've got to make it to the clearing, best view of the full moon. She had a point. The clearing was where everyone came to make out, drink, and tell ghost stories. It was tradition, and yet something deep inside me twisted, a primal warning. Suddenly, there was a rustling in the bushes ahead. Everyone stopped. The flashlight beam trembled in Sara's hand, shining into the thick brush. The noise was small at first, just a shuffling. Maybe a raccoon or a deer? That's what I told myself anyway. But then it grew. The rustling was joined by a low, scraping sound, like nails dragging through dirt. Probably an animal, someone whispered, though no one sounded convinced. Sara took a cautious step forward, aiming her light at the undergrowth. "If you're trying to scare us, it's not working," she called out, her voice wavering just enough to betray her unease. There was no reply. No more movement. Just that awful pressing silence. And then it happened. A figure burst from the bushes, a flash of something pale and grotesque. Sara screamed, the light dropping from her hand, spinning wildly as it hit the ground. In the chaos, I saw it just for a second, but it was enough. It wasn't human. It had the rough shape of a man, but its skin was stretched too tight over sharp bones, eyes too large, black and empty as a pit. It moved wrong, too fast, too jerky, like a marionette with its strings cut. It lunged at Sara, claws flashing in the darkness, and the smell hit us, rotting flesh, metallic and thick, choking the air. "Run!" I shouted, not caring if I sounded terrified. I was. My heart hammered against my ribs as I bolted, hearing the others stumbling behind me, their breaths ragged and panicked. Sara's scream cut through the trees, sharp and wet before it was swallowed by the night. I didn't look back. We crashed through the forest, the sound of snapping branches and heavy footsteps behind us growing louder. Whatever it was hunting us now. My legs burned, lungs screaming for air, but I didn't stop. Couldn't. A sharp cry echoed behind me, and I knew one of the others had fallen. The noise that followed, bones crunching, flesh tearing, made my stomach lurch. The monster was on them. I reached the clearing, breathless, heart pounding in my throat. The others weren't with me. I was alone, the moon casting a pale light over the open space. The creature's growls grew distant for a moment, but I knew it was out there, still hunting. It wouldn't stop until it had us all. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I'd seen, of what was happening. The stories were real. The creature that only awoke on Halloween night, it was real, and we were its prey. From the tree line, I heard the soft sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate. It was coming for me. And then, from behind, something cold brushed my neck. I spun around, but nothing was there. The clearing stretched out around me, wide and empty, but I felt the weight of eyes on me. My breath came in sharp, jagged gasps as I backed up, glancing from one shadow to the next, trying to see through the thick wall of trees that surrounded me like a cage. The footsteps had stopped. The creature was out there somewhere, but it was playing with me now. I could feel it, waiting, watching. My skin crawled, the air heavy with something unspoken, something that slithered just beneath the surface. I turned in a slow circle, eyes darting to the tree line, half expecting it to leap out from the darkness at any moment. The light from the moon flickered behind clouds, casting long shadows over the grass. Then I heard it again, a rustling from the trees behind me, followed by a soft, wet sound, like something being dragged. My heart clenched. Sara. I moved toward the noise, adrenaline surging through my veins despite every instinct screaming at me to run the other way. But I couldn't leave her. Not if there was even a chance she was still alive. The closer I got, the more the sound of dragging intensified, and then, just at the edge of the clearing, I saw her, or what was left of her. Sara's body lay crumpled at the base of a tree, half hidden in the shadows. Her eyes were wide open, staring blankly at the sky, but her mouth was twisted in a silent scream. The skin around her neck was torn open, and something dark glistened on the ground around her. The sight of her, so still, so broken, made bile rise in my throat. I knelt down, shaking, my hands trembling as I reached for her, but before I could touch her, I froze. There was movement, a small twitch of her fingers. I leaned closer, my breath catching in my throat. Could she still be alive? But no, as I looked closer, I saw it. Something was moving beneath her skin. A sickening ripple passed through her chest, as though something inside was shifting, pushing up against the surface. My stomach churned, and I stumbled back, horror and disbelief flooding my mind. And then, without warning, her eyes snapped toward me. I screamed. Sara, no, the thing that had been Sara, began to rise, her limbs jerking and cracking as though controlled by invisible strings. Her head lolled to the side, eyes empty and lifeless, but her mouth stretched into an unnatural grin, one too wide, too grotesque to belong to a human. What are you? My voice came out in a choked whisper, my legs refusing to move as I stared at the abomination before me. The creature that had once been Sara tilted its head as though considering me for a moment, and then it laughed. A horrible, raspy sound that sent shivers down my spine. I stumbled backward, my hand instinctively reaching for a branch on the ground. I clutched it tightly, my only defense against the impossible thing in front of me. But it didn't move toward me. It stood there, twitching, jerking, that awful smile still plastered on its face, as though it was waiting for something. And then from behind me I heard a low growl. I spun around, gripping the branch like a lifeline, and there it was, the creature. The real one. The thing that had torn through the woods and turned my friend into this. Its hollow black eyes locked onto mine, and in that moment I knew there was no running, no escape. This thing had been hunting long before we ever stepped foot in these woods, and it wasn't going to stop until it had finished its game. I took a step back, and Sara's body twitched again, moving closer. I was trapped. My pulse hammered in my ears, the growls and raspy laughter surrounding me, closing in. Without thinking, I swung the branch hard. It connected with Sara's, the creature's Kiyu's face, and the sickening crack of bone echoed through the clearing. The thing stumbled, falling back into the brush, but I knew it wasn't down for long. I turned and ran, my feet barely finding purchase on the soft earth as I sprinted toward the deeper part of the woods. I didn't care where I was going, just away from that clearing, away from them. The trees blurred past me as I ran, branches clawing at my arms, tearing at my clothes. My breath came in ragged gasps, every muscle screaming for me to stop, but I couldn't. I wouldn't, but no matter how fast I ran, I could still hear it. The growling, the laughter, and something else, something wet and heavy, slithering through the underbrush, chasing me. I didn't dare look back, but I could feel it, getting closer, closing in. Suddenly, my foot caught on a root, and I hit the ground hard, the air knocked from my lungs. I gasped, pain shooting through my chest, but before I could move, I felt it. Cold, bony fingers wrapped around my ankle, pulling me back into the darkness. And this time, there was no escape. The cold fingers tightened around my ankle, dragging me back through the dirt, the damp earth swallowing my screams. I kicked wildly, my heart hammering in my chest, but it was no use. The thing had me. The darkness of the forest swallowed me whole as I was pulled deeper into the trees, my body skidding across rocks and fallen branches. My head smacked against a root, stars exploding in my vision. I groaned, the world spinning, but I managed to claw at the ground, my fingernails digging into the soil in a desperate attempt to stop the thing from pulling me further into its domain. Then suddenly the pulling stopped. For a moment, all I could hear was my own ragged breathing and the rapid thud of my heartbeat. I twisted around, half expecting the creature to be looming over me, its black eyes gleaming in the moonlight. But the woods were still. Too still. I scrambled to my feet, my head still reeling from the fall, and staggered toward a large tree. My back hit the rough bark, and I clung to it for support, scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. My ankle throbbed where the thing had grabbed me, and I could still feel the cold lingering in my bones, like a touch that wouldn't let go. For a long moment, there was nothing. No growls. No laughter. Only silence. Had it given up? Had I escaped? I didn't believe it for a second. The air felt wrong, heavy, thick with something I couldn't name. The moonlight barely filtered through the twisted branches above, casting long, gnarled shadows across the forest floor. And in those shadows, I could feel it. The presence. Watching. Waiting. My hands shook as I wiped the dirt from my face, forcing myself to focus. If I stayed still, it would find me again. I had to move. I had to. The sound of something wet and slick squelched behind me. I froze, every muscle in my body locking up as the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I turned my head slowly, my heart slamming against my ribs, and that's when I saw it. It wasn't the creature. Not this time. It was Sara, or at least what was left of her. She stood at the edge of the clearing, her body half hidden in the shadows, but I could see the gleam of her pale skin, streaked with blood and mud. Her head hung at an odd angle like a broken doll, and her eyes, those empty, lifeless eyes, were fixed on me. She took a step forward, her legs jerking unnaturally, bones grinding beneath the skin with a sickening crunch. My stomach twisted at the sight of her, but I couldn't look away. "Sara?" My voice came out weak, barely more than a whisper, and I hated how small I sounded. But she didn't respond. She just kept coming, slow and deliberate, her limbs twitching with every movement. And then I heard it again, that low, raspy laughter echoing from somewhere deep within her throat. It wasn't her. Not anymore. Panic surged through me as I pushed myself away from the tree and ran. My legs burned, my breath ragged in my chest, but I couldn't stop. Not now. Not with that thing wearing Sara's face, stalking me through the woods like a twisted marionette. The laughter followed me, growing louder, more distorted, until it was all I could hear. I clamped my hands over my ears, desperate to drown it out, but it was inside my head, burrowing deep into my thoughts. And then snap. A branch broke somewhere ahead of me. I skidded to a stop, my heart seizing in my chest. The creature. The real one. I could feel it now, lurking just beyond the trees, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. I turned, frantically searching for any way out. My flashlight had long since been lost, and the woods were nothing but shadows and shifting shapes. But in the distance, through the thicket, I saw something, a faint glow just beyond the trees. The clearing. It was my only chance. I bolted toward the light, my feet pounding against the uneven ground. I could hear them behind me now, both of them. The creature with its low growls and Sara with her broken laughter echoing through the trees. I burst into the clearing, my breath coming in ragged gasps, and collapsed onto the cold ground. The moon was high now, casting everything in an eerie silver light. I looked around wildly, searching for something, anything, to defend myself with. Then I saw it. A large, jagged rock near the edge of the clearing, half buried in the dirt. I crawled toward it, my hands trembling, and hefted the rock into my grip. It was heavy, solid. If the creature came for me, I would make sure it didn't leave unscathed. I stood, wobbling on shaky legs, and faced the trees. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, slowly, the shadows at the edge of the clearing began to shift. The creature emerged first, its black eyes glinting in the moonlight, its skeletal form hunched and unnatural. It stalked toward me, its mouth curling into something that might have been a smile if it wasn't so full of malice. Behind it, Sara, or what was left of her, stepped into the light, her head still tilted at that impossible angle, her limbs jerking with every movement. I gripped the rock tighter, my breath catching in my throat. This was it. The creature lunged. I swung the rock with everything I had, feeling it connect with a sickening crunch. The creature stumbled, a growl ripping from its throat as black tar-like blood splattered the ground. But it wasn't enough. It wouldn't stop. Behind me, I heard Sara's broken laughter again, closer now, too close. I turned, but she was already there, her hand reaching for my throat. I screamed, swinging wildly, but it was no use. Her fingers closed around my neck, cold and impossibly strong. And then everything went black. The darkness was suffocating, cold and endless. I felt Sara's grip tighten around my throat, pulling me deeper into the abyss, the last flicker of life slipping from my grasp. But just when it seemed like the end, a flicker of warmth sparked somewhere deep within me, a tiny ember refusing to be extinguished. I wasn't ready to die. Not here. Not like this. Somewhere in the depths of my mind, something snapped. I opened my eyes, gasping for breath, and in a surge of adrenaline, I grabbed Sara's wrist with both hands. Her skin was ice cold, like death itself, but I fought against it, squeezing with every ounce of strength I had left. "You're not her!" I screamed, my voice hoarse and ragged. And then something miraculous happened. Her grip loosened. For a moment, the expression on her face shifted. Her lifeless eyes flickered with something familiar. Sara. The real Sara. I could see her in there, somewhere, trapped beneath the horror, buried deep within the shell of her own body. "Sara," I whispered, desperate. "Fight it. You can beat this." Her hand trembled, the grip around my neck weakening. For a heartbeat, it was like the forest had frozen, like time itself had stopped, waiting. Then with a sudden violent jolt, Sara let out a gut-wrenching scream. Her body convulsed, twisted, and for a moment it was as if the very air around her rippled. The creature inside her, the thing that had taken her, was losing its hold. And then, with one final agonizing cry, she collapsed. I dropped to my knees beside her, breathing hard, my entire body trembling. The moonlight washed over us, casting everything in an eerie silver glow. But Sara lay still now, her face peaceful, her body no longer contorted by the creature's unnatural control. I touched her shoulder, half expecting her to be gone, but then her eyes fluttered open. "Sara?" I whispered, barely daring to hope. She blinked up at me, confusion flickering across her face. What happened?" Relief flooded through me so hard I thought I might break apart. She was back. She was alive. Tears stung my eyes as I pulled her into a tight embrace, feeling her warm, real body against mine. It was over. We had made it. But the relief was short-lived. A low growl echoed from behind us. The creature. It wasn't finished yet. I spun around, heart racing, as the thing emerged from the trees once more. It moved slowly now, its skeletal body hunched and twisted, tar-like blood still oozing from the wound I'd given it earlier. But it was still coming, relentless and unyielding. We couldn't run anymore. Not this time. Sara stood beside me, her face pale but determined. "We have to finish this," she said, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. I nodded. We couldn't let it win. In the moonlight, I caught sight of something, an old, rusted metal spike lying half buried in the dirt near the clearing. Without thinking, I darted for it, grabbing it with both hands. It was heavy, sharp, and jagged. The perfect weapon. The creature lunged at us, faster than before, its eyes gleaming with hunger. But this time I wasn't running. With a roar, I drove the spike into its chest, the metal tearing through its flesh with a sickening squelch. The creature let out a shriek, its black eyes widening in shock as the tar-like blood poured from the wound, hissing as it hit the ground. For a moment it staggered, its body twitching, convulsing. And then it stopped. The creature let out one final, gurgling breath before collapsing to the ground in a heap of bone and flesh, its form crumbling into dust beneath the weight of the moon. It was over. For real this time. The woods were silent again, but not the kind of silence that pressed down on you like before. This was different. The weight had lifted, and for the first time that night I could breathe freely. Sara and I stood side by side, looking down at the pile of ash that had once been the thing that had hunted us. The nightmare was finally over. As the first light of dawn began to creep through the trees, we made our way back through the forest, hand in hand. The terror, the horror of the night lingered in the back of our minds, but it was fading now, replaced by the warmth of the rising sun. We had survived. And as we stepped into the light, leaving the shadows behind, I knew one thing for sure. We had beaten the darkness. Together.